Well, hello again, and welcome back to BiblioFiles. I am your host, Ian Andrews, joined by, in order, Adam, Missy, Emily, and Megan. How are you guys doing today?
Great.
Doing well. Thank you.
The director that we are going to profile today is maybe a fitting successor to Kenneth Branagh in this conversation, given how much I personally like his adaptations of literary classics. His name is Joe Wright. He is the director of the 2005 release Pride and Prejudice, starring Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden. And there's a funny thing about that, which is that we always thought it was Matthew McFadden. It is not. It is Matthew McFat-Ian. You heard that right. It is Matthew McFat-Ian. So if you're ever wondering how to pronounce the man's name,
there is a glottal stop in it. Matthew McFadden.
Matthew McFadden. A wonderful film, I thought. I mean, you guys were all around for the release of this. Do you like it or do you not, and why?
Wait, did you specify a film? I just thought you said
Pride and Prejudice.
No, I said Pride and Prejudice.
Okay.
You know, the Keira Knightley and Matthew McFadden.
That's right. It's easy, isn't it? It's easy to remember now. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I liked it myself. I know it was a contentious bit, but I actually really enjoyed it. And I also really, really loved the original Pride and Prejudice miniseries that BBC did it, right? It was BBC.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
This
is the source of the contention, right? A legendary 13-hour miniseries that had been
13
more
hours.
or less.
It wasn't 13 hours.
Was
it was
10?
6 hours.
It was not 6 hours.
Oh, it's very long. It was very long.
Like,
it was the one with Colin
Ian's
Firth,
like,
right?
It was 7 days. It was like one
Every
of
so
those
often I
weddings
exaggerate
that
for
goes on,
negative
and there are elephants, you know.
Well, originally when they released it, we didn't have these streaming services. So
Right.
actually it did take weeks and weeks because we had to wait for the next one, children.
And this may have contributed to its popularity, right? It was a movement instead
That's
of
right.
something you binge in a weekend.
Well, that's not all though. It was also Mr. Darcy.
Colin Firth.
He also
Firth, the
contributed to
legendary.
the movement.
Yeah.
Colin Firth. But
He
one of the
was
things
something
that
else.
stands out, correct me if I'm wrong, about that original miniseries adaptation is that it was pretty word for word, scene for scene, the novel.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. It was a faithful adaptation.
There was a lot of scene for scene stuff. As a matter of fact, so much so that who loved it and loved the 1995 BBC version. When I first saw the Joe Wright version, I thought going in, there's no way they can do this. I see the running time of this movie, and that is impossible because I was so in love with everything about the 1995. And then I watched the Joe Wright version, really enjoyed it. I thought a lot of things that we'll probably get into were very skillfully done and effective. And then went back and watched the 1995 one. And the only thing I could think about this movie that I had loved was, whoa, they got to get on with it. This thing's moving way too slow.
It affected your enjoyment of the first one.
Yeah.
See, I liked them both independently. I mean, I thought that the lengthy one was delightful and delicious and faithful to the original story. And I thought that the Joe Wright version was it was much more approachable because you didn't have to commit quite so many hours to watch it. And I thought that he did a lovely job too. It was extremely well acted. And I thought he managed to summarize, to include really significant portions of the story. The plot elements were all present. And where he summarized, he used a lot of cinema symbolism. Can you say that?
Sure.
In order to move the plot along without really doing damage or any kind of violence to the story itself. Kind of like what we were talking about with the mini series that was recently out about War and Peace. Was that also Joe Wright?
No,
Who did that one?
Andrew Davies, I think.
Andrew Davies. Yeah, I remember talking about this
episode for sure.
Oh, okay. Well, I remember talking about this on a previous podcast recently with you, that I appreciated in that particular miniseries the way that huge chunks of Tolstoy's text were summarized in a scene that was very symbolic and representative of what was going on. You know, it was suggestive.
I think specifically in this connection of the scene early in the Joe Wright Pride and Prejudice, where Keira Knightley is out in the fields in the morning, taking in the sunrise. and just enjoying it, and there's beautiful music playing, and you if you're just watching without thinking about the literary progress that Joe Wright is trying to make, it just looks like a beautiful morning scene with an actress in costume setting a kind of a pastoral stage.
Right.
But it also really does point up the romantic impulse in Elizabeth Bennet that is going to be the driving thematic philosophical force for her half of the novel.
Yeah.
And it's exactly what Missy's talking about.
Yeah.
In a moment, in a cinematic moment, all kinds of thematic, and I would even say literary progress is being made.
I would go one further and say that not only is it emphasizing that one scene is emphasizing her romantic impulse, but also it sets the stage for their state in society. She walks through the farmyard to get to their house, and you get to see how close they are to the way that their land works, which is not the situation of Mr. Bingley, for example. Like Mr. Bingley's sister Caroline would never walk through the muddy field the way that Elizabeth does in the very first scene. So we get to see her station immediately, which I think is also very efficiently done.
Yeah, excellent. I totally agree. And that's emphasized by the way that mud gets on the hems of her gown as she's doing that, right? She literally walks through the mud with this serene look of this is all my life and I'm really happy about it.
Right.
On her face.
And of course, that all comes up later in the drawing room scene.
It does.
Yeah. I think a similar thing happens in that scene where she's on the tire swing in the barn.
Yeah.
And she's spinning.
Not a tire, but
Is it a tire?
Probably not in the
no tires then.
1800s.
I can't remember. Oh yeah, no tires. The swing. She was just on a swing. And anyway, the point of it was she was going in circles on the swing. And as she turned, the camera took in the different seasons and time progressed. I thought that was really artfully done as well. There was there were a lot of artistic moments in the Joe Wright version.
So as I was reading about this, it's funny that you guys jumped right to the mud on her hems and how close they are to the land. This was actually a big decision that was under discussion between the screenwriter and Joe Wright. Now, this is a minor difference between Joe Wright and Kenneth Branagh. Joe Wright doesn't do any of the writing. He's just a director, and he works with screenwriters. And the screenwriter on Pride and Prejudice is a woman named Deborah Moggach, Moggach.
Gesundheit.
Yeah. And she did a beautiful job. She was given little to no direction, as it were, from the studio on how to adapt Pride and Prejudice. And she wrote something like 10 drafts over 2 years of the script. Her initial ones were as close to a shot for shot as she could get of the novel. And she backed it off after discussing with Joe Wright the kind of movie he wanted to make. And his impulses were twofold. First of all, he wanted to make it earlier in the 18th century, to shy away from the Regency feel of the production.
I like that too.
Characters feel more real because
Regency is nothing if not artificial. Is that what you mean?
Exactly. So that was one of his first adjustments, which she liked. And then his second impulse was, instead of doing a shot for shot of this novel, what I'd like to do is use some young person shorthand from our own era in the way that we film these scenes, in the kinds of settings and conversations that we get between the characters, while preserving Austen's dialogue.
For example,
it's true to the story, but our viewers will instinctively understand what's going on.
Yes. For example, the closeness between Elizabeth and her sister Jane, they're under the covers having sleepover talk. It's like immediately communicates their sister bond, but in a much more informal, personal, kind of modernized way.
Even 21st century way. Yeah.
Yeah. So those were his instincts. Now here's another point of interest. He had never seen and refused to watch the miniseries.
Wow.
Because he didn't want to make something that referenced it at all.
Wow. I love that.
I like that.
So that's really interesting. One of the points I was going to bring up is this is a doubly responsive work of art. Not only is he adapting a novel, but he's also, at least culturally, responding to a successful adaptation of the novel that came before him. And I just found out, no, he isn't. He isn't responding to it. What do you make of that?
I think that if he hadn't already seen it when he set out to do it, I think that's a really wise decision.
I do too,
so, Emily.
Because it allows him to be creative in his own right and not I mean, that puts him face to face with Austen instead
Mhm.
of it being mediated, right?
I would say there's another way to look at that, which is that he shut himself out of a step in a conversation about how to
That's
read
true, too.
Austen and how to portray it. It's not that that's a bad thing, but he could have, had he been familiar with the 1995 miniseries, he could have been in dialogue with that one as well, and added another layer of conversation around Austen's characters and
Yeah.
That's
her
true,
themes.
too.
So here's my question though, and I'm not picking nits, but isn't he doing that already, consciously or not? Because
What do you mean?
because the viewer's experience with Austen, let's say someone who loves everything Jane Austen, they've read the novel, they've seen the miniseries, and now they've seen his film. And the viewer themselves are participating in that conversation as they read Joe Wright and as they read whoever directed the miniseries and as they read Austen.
Well,
So
we
he
certainly are.
He did contribute to that.
Well,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I can already hear in what you're saying that he, even if he didn't watch it, there are some things that you just pick up in the water if you are working in British literature adaptation, right? So his
Right.
decision to avoid the Regency era like stereotypes that would maybe allow younger viewers or new viewers to take it more seriously, because with
Hmm.
90s Pride and Prejudice, Jane Austen, Regency adaptations, there's a certain stereotype of the
sheen.
kind of person even who watches that, you know.
Oh,
Absolutely.
totally.
So he's already, I would say that he's already culturally in conversation with it in some ways.
He also does those of us who are slightly older viewers and more experienced readers a service by not paying attention to the 1995 or even watching it, because now, as those of us who have seen them both know something about what two completely independent readers having no knowledge of each other glean from Austen.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
I
almost
agree.
a way to
Similar.
say it's similar, and it turns out it's a way to say here's essential Pride and Prejudice. Here's essential Jane Austen, thematically speaking. If two different people who have nothing to do with each other and didn't see each other's work said this thing and this thing, we can rub those two things together and come up with some conclusions.
I like that.
This whole conversation is reminding me of when I was doing my master's work, and I was forbidden. They completely forbade me from going outside of the original text when I was, preparing my classes and things like that. I was not allowed to read what critics had said about a work. I was instead supposed to dig into the work itself and come up with my own interpretive readings. I'm sure with the understanding that after the fact, after I had done so, then I would have something to say to contribute to the conversation that they were having there. But if I were to initially dive into the criticism, then I might be influenced in my reading and miss things because I was expecting what the critics had said instead of really listening carefully to the author. And I tend to agree.
Yeah, there's something to it for sure.
Well, part of what makes the movie so wonderful is its soundtrack.
The score.
Oh, it's lovely.
A whole generation of
that.
young piano players played that thing on
Yep.
repeat.
I still play it on repeat. I mean, not with my fingers.
Not with your fingers, though.
Spotify.
There's
It's
play
like,
and then there's
never
play,
seen that happen.
if we're honest. So
I wonder if that's a feature of the era in which Joe Wright was making this movie, 2005. I'm out over my skis on this, but it strikes me that the more recent a movie is, the more central constant music is to a soundtrack. I mean, if you watch a movie from the 70s, maybe even from the 80s, there are songs, there are tunes, there is music, but there's also long periods of silence that you hardly ever get anymore in movies. And I wonder if Joe Wright is in the vanguard of that, saying, you know what, the soundtrack is going to stand alone here and be one of the characters in the piece, as it were.
Well, and that goes back to his impulse to make things young and culturally relevant so that his viewers will get on board with Austen. And Austen scholars actually, if my internet sources are to be believed, Austen scholars believe with approval that Joe Wright kind of coined a genre when he made this film, that previous adaptations of works from that era were buttoned up, and as indeed the original era would have been, and that Joe Wright said, let's tell a human story about human things, and there's no need to buy into the ethos of the era in which the novel was written in order to tell the story. And
like akin to a Shakespeare adaptation.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really,
this one came after Shakespeare in Love.
Right.
And so there was a popular movement in that direction, but he kind of gets credit with doing it best.
Well, the people have been doing, I mean, as we all know, have been doing that with Shakespeare on stage and in film forever and ever and ever. So maybe that's just an application of that.
yeah, the update.
Yeah.
That's very
I
common
can
to take
see-
a classic work and set it in a different time period.
Right. But I can see not setting a different time period, even just the realism creeping into the Regency era Austen films. I can see Joe Wright creating a ripple effect where that's concerned. The new Emma comes to mind.
Yeah,
The
for sure.
emphasis is totally on the humanity and the physicality even of the characters. And that seems to be
Isn't-
like an extreme iteration of the same idea that Joe Wright is flirting with.
Isn't that faithful philosophically and thematically to Austen herself? I mean, isn't that the implication of Elizabeth Bennet in her
Yeah.
world?
I
Just a
think
little
so.
bit, to say all of this that I'm fighting
Pretense.
against is pretentious. And there's something, obviously, Austen herself didn't know how to say it as a 21st century woman, but that's the tendency, right? I think
Yeah.
if that's what Joe Wright is doing, he's doing something of a piece with what Austen was doing in the first place.
Yeah, I agree with that. Or at least Wright and Mogich together are.
Mhm.
I'm sure he was taking some cues from the script he was handed.
Mhm.
That's actually helpful though to know that he doesn't write his own scripts, because I think that puts future moments in our conversation that we're going to have today in context for me.
Yeah. Well, I want to get to that, but let's talk casting for a second, because here's an aspect of realism that maybe wasn't paid much attention to. The descriptions of Elizabeth Bennet from Pride and Prejudice, if I remember correctly, don't cast her as a new Helen of Troy.
Absolutely not.
But we have
they don't.
Keira Knightley in the lead here, and I think we could maybe cast her as Helen of Troy. So that's
She may have
and that
been
was-
cast as Helen of Troy,
Yeah, she
as
may,
far
I'm
as I
sure
know.
she's played her at some point, but that was a topic of conversation. Again, internet sources are telling me between the screenwriter and the director, it was difficult. The casting choice was really difficult. He wanted someone famous as Lizzie Bennet to draw viewers to the theater, but the idea of having someone that was unapproachably lovely instead of someone that was slightly homelier and more approachable was difficult for him to wrap his head around.
I actually thought that they ended up doing a good job of kind of roughing her up a little
Roughing
bit.
her up a little.
Can we say that
I
on
was
air?
trying to find a
Here,
better way
rub
to
some
say
of this
that.
on your face.
There it went. You know what I mean, though. That
Yes,
they
yes,
made
we
her.
do.
They made her a little more girl next door,
Yeah.
right? Like I totally, when I was 14, wore my hair like that, right? Like I'd had the low bun thing. Like it just
And the
was.
bangs,
It
yeah.
was more attainable. Maybe not her face,
Also,
but
I know we
Maybe
talked
not-
about this.
Maybe not her face.
Yeah, right. I know we talked about it in our conversation about the new Little Women movie, but there's also like a color theme for each
Ooh.
character
Mm.
in this movie. And I think that always works really beautifully
I
when
don't
the
think I
director
noticed
thinks
that,
of it.
Megan.
I didn't
Well,
notice
if you
it
think
either.
about it, Lizzie is always wearing something in the taupe or the brown
Mhm.
family.
Yeah.
And Keira Knightley looks lovely in anything, so it's fine. But again, it emphasizes this common, down home, earthy, real kind of character that I think is really necessary for her. Whereas Jane is always wearing like something
Baby
pink
blue.
or blue or
Mhm.
yeah,
Like,
something lovely and
virginal.
ethereal and virginal. Yeah, exactly. But Lizzie is always
And then it keeps
in a
going.
common way, you know?
the little the silly sisters. I call
Yeah.
them the silly sisters. The silly sisters are always wearing
Chartreuse.
yeah crazy
Frou-frou,
colors
yeah.
that don't look particularly good on them, or
Nope.
or like 3 patterns at once.
Yep.
Like they're always wearing something silly.
hmm
Wow, I didn't notice that. So costuming also is participating.
Helped with the casting
thematically.
choice, I think. Yeah.
Does the fact that that Matthew McFadden has a terrible, terrible haircut
his
and
hair.
hairdo the entire time, is that thematically
Why does he
significant?
do
I could
that?
hardly
I'm
look at it.
distracted by
No, it is. So one of the things
Distracted
that,
by how bad
that
you look.
Wright considered when casting Darcy is, well, we've got someone famous for Elizabeth. And one thing that he did respond to in the miniseries, which he hadn't seen, but how could you possibly get called up. And this is his first movie, by the way. This is his
Really? Is
directorial
that true?
debut.
Joe
my-
Wright, this
For-
is his
for a
first
feature
movie?
length, yeah.
Whoa,
Yeah, his
what a
first
home
film.
run.
Good Lord.
So for him to be invited to do this, he's been alive in the world and knows who Colin Firth is.
Right.
And so
Has
he's
probably
like,
seen
"Oh,
memes
no,
of Colin Firth
who
rising
am
out
I
of
gonna
that
cast?"
pond.
Right, exactly. Who am I going to cast as Darcy? And so it gave him an excuse, more or less, having handled the star appeal of the movie with Keira Knightley's casting. It gave him an excuse to go find someone who was, from his perspective, a big hunk of a man, like a big, tall, broad
Well,
kind
I
of guy
remember
whose beauty was not the point of his character.
I actually watched an interview about this. I think they specifically wanted Darcy to be manly in like the old-fashioned sense of the word, like
Yeah.
like lumberjacky,
Big and strong,
like
yeah.
big and strong, like gruff.
Maybe even kind of a lout, a little loutish.
Yeah, like he's huge. He's a giant
Not allowed.
person.
Nope.
Yeah.
Too far, Ian.
I think so too. I was really rolling over
Don't
thinking,
you
I
say
don't think
lout.
that's
Don't
what
you
I
call
would
him a
say.
lout.
Don't you say that
Because-
about Darcy.
Well, right. Because I think the casting choice was so good because he looks right. He looks
Yeah.
manly and, lumberjacky, but he's got a really soft voice
Mm.
and he's got very like sensitive eyes and he's
Very
got like,
expressive eyes. That's
he's
totally
very
true.
expressive. And so it works for the character that's basically supposed to communicate the depth of feeling without ever saying anything. It's supposed to be
Mhm.
all in his face, all in his eyes. And I think he did a great job. It was great casting.
Well, it's one of the things that he was not known outside the UK until this movie came
Right.
out. So it definitely started his career. And he's gone on to all sorts of heights since then.
He plays a
Can't
really
make
weird
the
character usually.
Tomlet without cracking a couple Gregs.
Can't make a Tomlet without cracking some Gregs. Oh,
What?
as a character in a film, as in a TV show that we watched, he says that to one of his subordinates. They've been
Oh.
caught doing, or they haven't been caught yet, but there's a chance of them getting caught having broken the law. And he's going to throw his young subordinate under the bus. Subordinate's name Greg, his name Tom, and he
It's
looks at
coming
him
into
with
focus.
total seriousness, and he says, "You can't make a Tomlet without breaking some Gregs." And it's funny. It's truly deeply funny stuff. So he's got range too as an actor. Range, I
got
tell you.
Well, we
range.
can talk about range today
We
too.
will.
Yeah.
We certainly will. Yeah. Okay, so the reason I bring up casting is because there's some funny casting details that I've uncovered. For example, the casting of Rosamund Pike
Oh,
was
yeah.
a little iffy for a couple of reasons. Number one, he and Pike met on the set of this movie and were married for a minute before they
Oh.
were
Who?
divorced later.
He and
Matthew
Joe
Wright.
Matthew McFadden?
No,
Oh.
Joe Wright.
No,
And
Matthew
Rosamund
McFadden.
Pike. Oh, I see.
has
I
been
thought he's
through
married to Keely Hawes.
Hawes
Yeah.
forever and
Forever and
ever.
ever.
Okay,
Like, is
okay.
that cheating? Okay.
So there's that. But then also the casting choice was difficult because even though she was perfect for Jane, she had broken up recently with her boyfriend, who was already cast as Bingley.
Oh, no. Really?
Already
Yeah.
cast as her
I
love
didn't know
interest in the
that.
movie.
Yup. Isn't that great?
I
Well,
mean,
they did
yeah.
great acting then.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That's so
Yeah.
awkward.
Can you imagine acting opposite your ex while being directed by a guy that you're beginning a romantic relationship with?
Oh my gosh. She probably broke out in hives the moment that movie was over.
That's so funny. Oh, that whole thing is great. I just love it. Whew. Okay,
Whew.
so the last thing I wanted to bring up about this particular movie before we move on to other times Joe Wright has done this again is the soundtrack. But you already mentioned that earlier.
Oh,
Dario Marinelli just did some beautiful, beautiful things for this. And what I remember most is the scene you talked about, Dad, with the tune is actually called Dawn. I've been listening to it for years, and
Mhm,
it's
it's
playing over
Best
her
study
walking through
music
the-
ever.
Oh, yeah. Or what about Lizzie on Top of the World when
Yep.
she's standing on
Ugh.
that cliff's edge overlooking the moors out there?
Oh, it's amazing.
My goodness. So a visually stunning treat of a movie that's actually pretty faithful to the novel and plays nice with other adaptations, whether intentionally or not.
Would recommend.
Is that because does the fact that it plays nice with other adaptations a statement that Austen lends herself better to adaptation than maybe other writers?
That's a really good question.
One of the things you can say as a high school lit teacher of Pride and Prejudice is that it's broad.
Mm.
That's true.
It's not subtle. Pride and Prejudice.
Do you think people do it because it's easier to adapt, or because there's such interest in it and staying power?
Oh, no, I
Because
don't
the
think
themes are very universal.
the latter for sure. I
Yeah.
don't think they do it because it's easy to adapt. I wonder if the fact that adaptations play nice with each other testifies to the fact that it's
Easy to
pretty
adapt.
straightforward.
It's saying one thing, obviously.
Right.
I see what you mean. Yeah.
It's also, if I remember correctly, it's been some years since I've read Pride and Prejudice, but the dialogue is really there for you, ready for the taking. The jokes are fresh.
Oh,
They
yeah.
don't really age.
It's a stone masterpiece. I just don't think
It
it's
really
particularly
is.
subtle. That's all.
No,
Right.
I don't
Yeah.
think so either.
Well, that wasn't her goal.
Right. Her goal was
She
comedy.
might not
Yeah,
have been
she
your,
wanted
I mean,
to be
you might
funny.
not have been her goal. I mean,
I don't
I'm not
know.
sure she was ready for you.
Yours.
Whoa.
What does that mean?
Woo.
I love
Thick
that
candy
book.
shell.
That's a great book. You're the one with a candy shell on it.
I love that book.
That was great. Well, so Joe Wright, A Gift to the World in 2005 with his directorial debut, does it again with the release of Anna Karenina, which was, well, I don't know. What do you think? As good or
Not the
better?
one with where it
2012.
starts and there's a thing he does that makes it clear that the whole thing's happening on a stage, like a revolving
Yes.
stage.
Yes.
Yes.
So that's one of the
Okay.
major talking points of this whole
Most
thing.
of it takes place on the stage, actually.
It was
Well,
very cool.
It turns out all of the filming, I found out, was done on a soundstage. There wasn't exterior shots and stuff.
Even in the fields.
That's what I wondered too, but that's what they said, is that it was shot on a soundstage.
Keira
Maybe
Knightley
they-
said it was the hardest movie that she's ever made. She said it was the most difficult acting she's ever done.
I can imagine.
Because it was like, she said it was like ballet.
Because of the production or because of the
Because of the production, because of the directorial choices, because of the choreography. It is
And
actually filmed and staged like a performance on stage.
Yeah, it's very theatrical in its presentation. And sometimes when they do that kind of theatrical presentation, it doesn't work because being in the theater is part of what makes a theatrical drama
Of course.
so wonderful, and to just film something like that and watch it on your TV, it kind of loses something in translation, but it did not with
takes
Joe
away that.
Wright's version of Anna
Well-
Karenina. It added something to it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Talk about condensing. He's taking, let's see, Pride and Prejudice is what, 250 pages, 300 pages. Well, now he's taking like a 900,000 page novel and condensing it into
Is it
2
900,000,
hours.
Emily? Don't you think maybe it's more like 900?
I meant 900 dash or 1,000,
Oh.
not 900,000.
Fair enough. I did
But-
actually mean 13 hours, so I guess that's on me.
Part of what happens is he spends so much time focusing on Anna's story, which it's named Anna Karenina. You kind of have to do it, but like he loses a lot of the meat of the story, which is Levin and Kitty's romantic
I think so, too.
relationship.
I thought so too.
But and I do think that there's some problematic issues with that, but he makes up for that thematically with this decision to stage it in the theater, right? It's the symbolic representation, the artistic decision to have a discussion that's constantly going on underneath the surface of the plot about this artificial stage.
Yeah,
and
who's
then
acting
the
and who's
feel
not.
like when Levin flings open the doors of the theater and walks out into the snow, like that's the most glorious moment of the movie, I think.
Beautiful.
What do you mean when you say he makes up for a light treatment of Levin and Kitty with this theatrical directorial decision making? How does that make up for it?
Well, Levin and Kitty's story is a counterpoint to Anna's in that it's having a conversation about true love, which is natural and it's based in reality and telling the truth and being honest, which sometimes means being honest about how ugly you are. And so he doesn't really get to have that conversation with the actual details of the relationship, right? Like we don't see the point where Kitty goes off and tries to be perfect in her good works at the spa or wherever it is that she goes with her family. But we do get to see this image of Levin being in the earth, like he's outside of the stage, he's in the grass, he's mowing with the peasants, like And that kind of is where he has that conversation instead.
Yeah, I just think because we rewatched it in preparation to talk about it today, and what I remembered having seen the movie a while back was the opening scene, which is it all takes place in one room, and it's clear that it's one room. It's an old theater, and I thought, oh, what a cool device that he's using to make this happen. The dancing and the choreography was so spectacular. And then the doors open up, and Levin walks out into the world, and then I assumed that was kind of it. I'd forgotten that theater plays a role as almost a character in the story for the entire film. And it really does. I mean, there are some moments that stick out. For example, when Levin's initial proposal is refused, he leaves the restaurant to go out into the street and walk away despondent. And in order to do that, to go back out from all of the posturing and the posing that deems him not good enough for this whole scenario, and to get back to real life, he ascends into the bowels of the theater above the stage, which is really interesting. He's going from high society down into the gutter, out into the street.
But actually, he's transcending it.
Yeah, he's above all of what you begin to see over the course of the story is the muck of polite society, where people are brutal and vicious and uncaring.
That's so cool.
It's
go down to go up, like Dante.
Right? Yeah, exactly. It's very, very much so.
That's neat.
The opposite of that is I was thinking of there's a moment where Anna and Vronsky are making out in a field, and they're out in nature, which is supposed to be Levin's territory, and it's beautiful and floral, and it has all of the natural qualities which are supposed to be positive. But Anna looks up at the trees, and the romantic moment is kind of over. She looks up and she says, "But I'm damned," like looking up. So she's honest. She's in the place of truth and reality, but she knows, like, she looks up, she looks at the sky and sees that she's exposed, and what she is now like seen by the heavens.
Because it's out in that natural scene.
I think so. Yeah. Because her love belongs in the theater. It's something artificial and manufactured. But when she goes public with it and she decides to live that way, there's a moment where she's out in reality and it's exposed.
Yeah. That's so cool.
So the theater then is, so far based on these comments, is artifice and pretense, and reality lies above it, below it, outside it. And so it's a commentary on the whole world of Anna Karenina that it happens inside a theater.
I think so too. Yeah. And I think it's also constructed. That's a huge part of it.
There you go.
There are multiple times when the camera angles actually show you the set pieces, and you can see that they're this thin and made of cardboard, so it's a comment about the world of high society in this particular period of time, and how it's a construction of humanity, and not a very good one at that.
I think it's so in keeping with Tolstoy's idea. If we're thinking about a literary adaptation, the author is so present in the mind of the director, we hope. And Tolstoy is always portraying the life of the salon, of like the high society in Russia, as a pageant. It's a pageant, it's a play, everyone's acting. And there are written rules to it. It's like a dance. And all of those elements are emphasized so much by this particular set choice. I think it was an apt tool.
There was, you mentioned ballet, and they actually do in the opening scenes move in ballet choreography. Anna dances, in particular with the arm movements. They move their arms over their heads. And that is actually echoed later in the story when Kitty bathes Levin's brother. When he thought his brother brings the prostitute into their home, and Levin is so apologetic and tells Kitty that she won't see her, but Kitty instead goes and bathes the wounds of his brother and takes care of him and nurses him back to health. They move his arm in that way, in that same movement, which is, I wonder what that says, if it's entirely artifice, or if
there are elements of humanity you can't shake,
or I don't know. I don't know what that is.
Or that human life is artistic.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was wondering, as you were talking about this, if the contrast is between reality and pretense, or if it's things natural and unnatural.
Mhm.
Is it because pretense is a theme and certainly present there? But I also remember when I read Anna Karenina, the Tolstoy's ability to portray the unnatural relationship that grows between Anna and her lover.
Vronsky.
Yeah, Anna and Vronsky. And the very natural love that eventually grows between Kitty and Levin. And that ends up in a way, it's almost like a chivalric. It's almost like a nod to Dante's chivalric love idea that eventually his relationship with Kitty, that romantic love, opens his heart to a divine love.
Yeah. For
And it
11's
ends
case,
up
for sure.
being like a
Yeah.
doorway into relationship with God.
Yeah.
The other ends up becoming a different kind of doorway, a doorway into a true hell, as you mentioned. He portrays in that one scene, and it ends in her literal death.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Yeah, they in that same scene where where Kitty is bathing his brother and it looks like ballet, the prostitute is holding the brother like a pieta. So I wonder if it's actually a comment not so much on artifice, but on the true roots of beauty,
Yeah.
The
divine,
path of-
divine love. Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense.
That is interesting. I also, when I watched it the first time, and I haven't watched this in many years, but
It's worth
there was
another
something
go
about,
around.
yeah, this conversation is making me want to go watch it again. But there was something about you were talking about the insubstantial nature of the set being, you can see that it's thin, the walls are thin, and things aren't, the different
Artificial.
scenes,
Not
not
real.
just artificial, but not separated as
Mhm.
much as they seem that they are. And I remember coming away from it feeling like not only was that an artifice, but also it was like it emphasized the tissue type nature of the world around us as compared to what's beyond it, And
Yeah.
I think that Tolstoy is really doing that in his story. He's wanting to make things that are eternal and significant come to the surface and make the things that we as human beings get really caught up in that ensnare us and maybe keep us from seeing into the eternal, to make them look thin in a way, insubstantial. I wonder if, I don't know if that was in Joe Wright's mind as he was designing the set and, staging it the way that he did, but something about that, it almost looked like a beehive, those little rooms that were so tiny and the walls are so thin and you know what I mean? And interconnected. I don't know. I wonder what he was doing with that.
I don't know either, but along those same lines, as things get worse and worse for Anna with her drug addiction and mental instability and just guilt torturing her, more and more of her fights with her lover, Vronsky, begin to be depicted by the camera with the use of mirrors to where you're not actually looking at either one of the characters. You're not seeing either of the actors. You're only seeing their faces from across the room at a strange angle in a mirror, and they're distorted. And I think that has a lot to say also. I mean, I think he's using that element to make a point about the story and about the characters. The actions they've undertaken are distorting them to themselves and to one another.
Yeah.
They can't see each other clearly anymore.
Wonderful. I was thinking about Anna Karenina and War and Peace and all the Tolstoy and the difficulty that it is to condense all of that stuff and all the stuff that goes on in a novel like Tolstoy's that is internal monologue for pages and pages and pages. How in the world do you do it? And that idea of seeing the characters in their reflection in a mirror that's off center, or that's at an oblique angle or something like that, just encapsulates so much of what's going on in Anna's mind for giant chunks of that
without having to say any of it. I mean, it's the same thing he does in Pride and Prejudice. It's visual shorthand for
Yeah, you have to use the art of the medium you're working in.
Right. And it's not that it's the same. It's not the same because you're not going into the detail and you don't hear Anna's words of internal monologue or better yet, Tolstoy's words describing Anna's thoughts, which is where the real punch happens, I think. But you get something else that is thematically similar, right? It's shooting for the same thing. It's saying this is a a distorting, destructive, unnatural, artificial effect that this is having on these guys. Cool.
You know, that makes me want to ask that, because you're right. I had never thought about that, but I'm reading War and Peace. I haven't read Anna Karenina. I want to, but in War and Peace, his editorializing, it's not just that his dialogue is great, which it is, but then he gets done with a conversation and then tells you how it seemed to both of the people who were having the conversation and how they seemed to onlookers.
Right.
And
that's
and
where
he
he's the
interprets
best that
it.
ever
he
was.
does all the interpretation, and
Yep.
you're right. That's where he's best. And so in some senses, an adapter has the hardest possible job with
I agree.
Tolstoy.
I agree.
Because essentially what we're getting is Joe Wright instead of Tolstoy.
Mm.
Yep.
But the other thing it does, though, is, and maybe this is about the medium of film, it does erase a distance between the reader and the story. And you can argue all day about how the reader's own imagination is just as powerful, but it's different. The effect is different. Watching Keira Knightley as Anna implode is viscerally painful and difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that Tolstoy could have made me feel something similar, and will when I read
He
it.
will.
Right?
You never
And he'll
read
do
it.
it with words, and he'll do it by describing her and describing her
he
aspect.
will.
But being able to sit and experience that visually was a unique treat.
Well, I think you said it right. It's uniquely visceral in a way that only a visual medium can be. I
Well,
agree.
what he had to do is imply what was going on in their minds through little ticks and tricks on the screen.
like the mirror that Ian just talked about.
Mhm.
That's a great example of that.
or like Jude Law's whole perfect being, whom I love. He was so
You've
good
got
in
such
that
a
movie.
man crush.
I do. I have a huge man crush on Jude Law, sue me. But he was so good. He was so good as
Yeah.
Karenin in that film. It was so restrained and so hurt and wounded, and the way that he comported himself, I fancied. Did exactly what you're talking about with the mirrors. It bottled up a ton of internal dialogue from the novel and put it on Jude Law's face.
Mhm.
Also, just have to say, Matthew McFadden as Steva is amazing.
Wasn't he great? Do you guys remember enough of it to remember
No.
Matthew
No, I don't
McFadden in
remember
that
that.
role?
Who's Steva?
Her brother,
Anna's
Anna's
brother.
brother.
Oh, gotcha.
With his hair sticking straight up off the top of
Oh,
his
yeah.
head, and his eyes
Mhm.
are always completely wide. He's going.
I remember her relationship with her brother
fantastic.
in the story, but I don't remember that element of the movie.
He's great.
It's great.
He was Dickens' character good.
So
Yeah,
Joe Wright,
it's a Dickensian character coming to life.
Sure.
Joe Wright has a thing for recasting the same
Yeah.
people. We're running out of time, but I'd love to gloss over the rest of his career shortly if we can. Is that okay?
Please do.
Well, I mean, he does a great job with Pride and Prejudice. He does a great job with Anna Karenina. Even though the story is the worst, he does a great job with Keira Knightley again. So now it's getting weird in
Mhm.
Atonement.
Yep.
And then recently we find out that Joe Wright is going to do Cyrano. And it's exciting. I like other Joe Wright movies are great. The Darkest Hour was great.
The Darkest
Peter
Hour.
Dinklage is
The
great.
Darkest Hour.
Yeah.
Peter Dinklage is
Love-
great.
We
Love
love Peter.
Peter
He's our favorite
Dinklage.
dwarf.
The
It's
Dinkles.
gonna be
Love the Dinkles.
amazing. And then we watched it.
Oh my Lord, you guys.
What happened? And well, first of all, what happened?
Actually, we know what happened. We figured it out. You know how you said, Ian, that Joe Wright doesn't write his own movies, he just
Mhm.
directs them?
Yep.
Well, Peter Dinklage's wife wrote the script for Cyrano, which Peter Dinklage was going to star in. And it seemed like no one had the heart to tell her that it was
Yeah,
so bad. And they
Well,
just
it
had
was
to
a
do it
great
because
idea.
Peter Dinklage loves his wife and Joe Wright and Peter Dinklage are tight. And it was like a pity. That's
that's
the only
horrible.
possible interpretation I can give it. That's positive. It was
I don't
so,
even think
so
she's
bad.
overstating. I don't even think she's overstating it.
I haven't seen it.
Ian,
But
I
we were
wanted to
watching it.
see
Ian
it.
and Emily and I were watching it together, and Ian stood up in the middle of the movie and left because he could not bear it. He
I
hated
couldn't
it
do it.
so much.
Really?
terrible.
You walked out on the film?
Yeah, I
Well,
came
okay.
How
back.
many
Peter
times have you done that?
Dinklage.
I
Not
just
very
want to be
many.
clear that we thought it's a great idea, right? It should have worked.
Well,
Peter,
yeah,
Peter Dinklage
talk
should
about that, Emily.
absolutely. Well, Peter Dinklage absolutely should be playing the role of Cyrano. It
But-
makes complete
yeah.
sense.
Well,
Um,
thematically, the idea of Cyrano de Bergerac, for those of you listeners who don't know, is that there's a man who has he feels disfigured by his ugliness. And in
It's his
the
nose
typical,
specifically.
right,
Yeah.
in the traditional version, he's got a gigantic nose, a huge schnoz, and he's self-conscious about it. And he thinks that it makes him repulsive. And in fact, maybe it does. I mean, he really is so ugly in this interpretation. And he's in love with this girl, but he thinks that she's not going to love him the way that he is, even though they're actually friends, because he's so ugly. And so handsome soldier comes along who looks right, but is empty-headed. And Cyrano decides to put his own brilliant words into beautiful man. Therefore, his love will, love his mind somehow. It's super weird. It's a little twisty, but what they
It's
did
very
in the
French.
Peter Dinklage version is very, very French.
Is
They said, okay, maybe we're going to change the disfigurement a little bit. And instead of give him a nose problem, he'll just be really, really short.
We'll make him a dwarf.
A good concept, right?
What a setup. Okay, Megan, deliver the coup de grace.
Well, I don't know if I can deliver the coup de grace because mostly I'm just speechless at how it missed. I mean, how could it miss? It's Peter Dinklage. He's an excellent
here's
actor.
one of the problems. And I am competent and qualified to give this.
Yes,
particular
please.
blow. They decided to make it a musical, and there was not a singable tune in the piece.
because
It was a
Oh.
musical?
they had the National write the music,
They had Matt Berenger of the National.
which it's
write
just
the
not the
soundtrack.
right tone. I didn't.
There was
think.
No.
one song in the whole thing as Cyrano and his men are preparing for a suicide mission of a battle, and the song was performed by Glenn Hansard and name of the other guy. It'll come to me. Two folk musicians,
Mhm.
and since the National is a folk band, it
Yeah,
made
that one
perfect sense
worked.
for folk musicians to sing it, and that one worked pretty well. And every other song in the whole piece was unsingably, destructively terrible.
Well,
So
it did
you
feel like
cannot
they
take
had
it
a,
seriously.
yeah, they mixed up their genres. Everyone's dressed in period garb, and yet they're dancing and singing in the streets
National.
as if it's like a Broadway show, and then the music is folksy, the National. None of that works together.
It was
I have to
awful.
see
Full
it.
stop.
It sounds like
So
Mystery
bad.
Science Theater 3000 material.
Now, what I
Well,
will
we
say
really
is
laid
there were
into
some
it. We did.
beautiful. There were some beautiful visuals. I didn't think
It was
that
actually nominated
the
for a couple of
directing
Academy
wasn't-
Awards.
wasn't
I just think
terrible.
it's pity. It's pity all the way. It's all an inside job.
It's really bad.
I don't
That's
know.
horrible.
Oh, you
I
haven't seen
do-
it. Just watch it.
We had such a violent. I think our violence of reaction is down to the fact that we were really,
We wanted it to
So
be
Excited about
bad.
hopeful.
but
Just
what-
disappointed.
I would love to talk about why. Like, what happened? Why isn't it as good as his other work?
Well, Ian already said the music
Yeah, I think we-
detracted,
It
right?
was
Yeah.
terrible.
Well, that's certainly part
the
of
script
it.
was terrible.
The script was bad. The music was bad.
So you think that the visuals are up to his artistically, and even with symbolically, was it up to his usual
Hmm.
standards?
Yeah, I actually thought so.
Yeah,
I thought
I thought so.
Can
thought
I
that
suggest
Go ahead,
something?
Dad.
Is it possible? Has anyone ever seen a great adaptation of the Cyrano de Bergerac
Yes.
story?
No, it's
Roxanne.
source text.
Roxanne was amazing.
I would say
Was
that
it?
Roxanne was great.
Roxanne
I
was
thought-
great.
Is
Steve
that
Martin.
Steve Martin?
Roxanne, go
Yeah.
watch it.
Okay, so they turned it into a
Farce.
Saturday Night Live style comedy,
Right.
And that worked.
and maybe that's why it worked. Also, Steve Martin is an absolute genius.
He's a force to be
So was
reckoned
Peter
with.
Dinklage, though. That guy is
Hey, big
really
nose.
good.
I do think
Big
though.
nose, I give you this and you give me.
I give you
Big
this, and all
nose.
you can come up with is big
Big
nose.
Mhm. That
That's
you might be
pretty
onto
good.
something, Dad, because Peter Dinklage, what he has going for him is he's a serious, dramatic actor, and he's moving and riveting, and takes himself very seriously because that's the role that he plays. And there was no hint of irony or humor in his interpretation of this, and yet all the other parts. So the only way to save this movie was to laugh, and you weren't allowed to
Right.
do that.
That's well put,
I
Megan.
wonder if Cyrano isn't the source text itself isn't kind of a French blackish sort of comedy.
I think it is supposed to be. I think maybe they misidentified the genre.
It's the original idea is beautiful ugly, right?
Yeah, but
Yes.
I mean, his whole goal is to get some beautiful guy to woo his girl.
Well, in
That's the
but he's
here's
got to
the
come
other-
around
that's
the
called
corner and
fustication
realize.
and futility right
Hang
there.
on,
He's got to
hang on.
come
The
around the
other
corner and
thing they
realize
did-
beautiful ugly.
Amen.
the other thing that they did that may have hurt the presentation a little bit was that they tweaked that part of the story. And what he is doing actually is reluctantly, because Roxanne asks him to, aiding this guy she is apparently head over heels in love with in giving her what she needs to be happy, which he already knows better than that guy is for her lover to be intelligent. So she is a swooning ninny who's
She's a
fallen for a pretty
ninny.
This
face.
is true to the text.
Absolute ninny.
She's a swooning ninny, and he is out of the goodness of his heart sort of falling on his own sword.
You know, and
See, that sounds like a hallway farce. I think trying to do that,
Or a Hallmark movie.
trying to do that straight, I don't know if that could ever succeed.
I do think that, yeah, I think Megan, you're onto something, because her performance didn't match the compellingness of his.
Nope.
So it wasn't worth it in the end. It didn't feel worth it.
No, you actually caught yourself from the beginning. Well, if you were me, I caught myself from the beginning thinking, her? Really?
Yeah.
And you lost at that point. It's nothing against that actress. She was lovely. I'm sure she was talented. She had nothing to work with.
Well, and I think that's the source text. Like, I think
Yeah.
that that's actually the way it is. Because she has to be shallow enough to choose
fall
the
for it.
beautiful soldier over the intelligent man.
Right. I think it's a farce. And I don't know. I didn't see Gerard Depardieu, who's got the famous version. Did anybody see it?
No, I never
No.
did.
No, I haven't seen it either.
I'd like
All
to.
I know is I
though.
wouldn't want to see a slapstick version of War and Peace or Anna Karenina.
Right.
But a slapstick version of Cyrano goes just fine.
It was great.
Yeah.
See, Roxanne, everyone.
Roxanne.
I
Okay.
know it's all I
well,
can think of.
So gentle listeners, thank you for joining us on this journey. This is such fun, and we can't wait to do it again. Here's what I will say in closing: go watch you some Joe Wright films if you haven't already. The man is great. Maybe stay away from Cyrano.
Or watch it just for the lulls.
Maybe
Yeah,
someone will
just-
disagree with us.
Mystery Science Theater it. If you do disagree, I will fight you. Okay.
So Megan Andrews, everyone with the strong opinions. If you
I
like
know.
Comments
Cyrano,
below in the
you're
chat
wrong.
box.
If you were wondering if I was an Andrews, now wonder no
Now
longer.
we-
I
wonder
fit
no
right
longer.
in, everyone.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you all for your insights as usual. And until we meet again, my friends, happy reading.
Happy
Happy
reading.
reading.
Reading.